بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ونبينا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. Inshallah, today we will be discussing chapter number 14 along with chapter number 15. These two chapters are very, very similar. The first one is in regards to the armor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the second one is in regards to the helmet of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They're very brief chapters. Each one has only two narrations. So inshallah, we'll try to discuss both of them in this session. The first session, Babu Maja fi sifati dir'i Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the chapter in regards to the armor of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Before we can go into discussing the hadith, the narration, I wanted to briefly talk about Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam wearing the armor itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many verses in the Quran talks about tawakkul. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is wearing an armor in the battle of Uhud, as it comes in this narration, and in wearing a helmet in other occasions, just as Fath Makkah and other times, these might raise a concern into our minds that why did Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who we believe to have the highest form of tawakkul, would feel the need to wear something that would be a preventive measure? Rather, it should be in the form of tawakkul. And we should look at all the different verses about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He talks about tawakkul, وَمَن يَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ. That if a person has tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if he puts himself in the hands, in the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَهُوَ حَسْبُهُ, he will suffice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will suffice. Similarly, other verses, وَعَلَى اللَّهِ فَلْيَتَوَكَّلِ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, that every believer should have tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's numerous verses in the Quran that talk about tawakkul. But to truly understand the concept of tawakkul, we need to understand three stages. And this should become part of our personality, and it should become part of our behavior, so that way all of our efforts and our decisions go according to this. There are three stages. As Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was instructed in the Quran, that وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, that do mashura, have a meeting in regards to whatever you're intending to do with the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. But after holding this meeting, whatever decision, whatever you intend to do, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ, if you have made a firm intention, after that, فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ, then put your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the three stages that every believer should abide by is we have to make sure we don't fall into ta'attul, we are acting upon tawakkul, and we do not interfere with tafweed. So these are three stages. Ta'attul in the Arabic language means to lay back and to be relaxed and not to do everything 100%. Not to exhaust all of our efforts. Tawakkul, on the other hand, means that after exhausting all your efforts, you have done utmost everything to accomplish this, then to leave the results in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And tafweed is do not start thinking as to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made the decision that He made. That is tafweed. That we have done everything, and then if something doesn't work out, if we didn't accomplish something after exhausting the efforts, then it's tafweed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of Wallahu khairul makirin, is the best of all planners. We have to leave that in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was asked about tawakkul. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentioned a very brief hadith which became the principle of tawakkul. That Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was asked about leaving a horse or any other camel or any ride without tying it and having tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam replied, "A'qilha wa tawakkal." First, you need to tie that horse. You need to make sure that you take advantage and you prepare yourself for everything, and then leave the decision of what happens to your ride in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because a believer only looks up to whatever he can do. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He mentions about struggling and working hard in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the believer's job is just to prepare and exhaust all the efforts, but the ultimate decision and the result, the ending result, is always in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in numerous verses in the Quran talk about mujahada. Mujahada, that's exactly what it means. That if a person just struggles, a person is just putting forth his efforts, that itself is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is looking for, and the results are in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, inshallah we will study these in the narration as well, that whenever he prepared to the best of his ability. He planned everything. He prepared with every person and every talent that he can utilize. But then the ultimate result that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the famous dua on the battle of Badr, that he said, "Ya Allah, these are a handful of Muslims. If you were to wipe them out tomorrow, there will not be anyone reciting the kalima La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah." That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate decision maker. But the efforts were 100%. The efforts from a believer is always 100%, and then the results are in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is where a believer should stand. That there should not be any ta'atul on behalf of a believer. That there should not be anything that is not done in attempt to gain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But tawakkul is to leave the ending results in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands, and never ever question as to why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made this decision, because that is now we're stepping over our boundaries and we're going into taqdeer and tafweez. So this is something that we hand over to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we accept whatever comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That we have come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we live for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the exact reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wore the armor. Now inshallah we will study, we would read the narration and go into a little bit of detail. وبالإسناد المتصل منا عن الإمام الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى قال حدثنا أبو سعيد عبد الله بن سعيد الأشج قال حدثنا يونس بن بكير عن محمد بن إسحاق عن يحيى بن عباد بن عبد الله بن زبير عن أبيه عن جده عبد الله بن زبير عن الزبير بن عوام رضي الله عنه قال كان على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم أحد درعان فنهض إلى الصخرة فلم يستطيع فقعد طلحة تحته وصعد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حتى استوى على الصخرة قال سمعت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول أوجب طلحة. Zubayr ibn Awam radiyallahu anhu narrates that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was wearing 2 pieces of armor during the battle of Uhud. Thereafter Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam attempted to climb a boulder, elevated area, a larger piece of rock, a boulder, but was unable to. He then requested Talha radiyallahu anhu to sit and with his aid climb the boulder. Zubayr radiyallahu anhu said, I heard Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam say on that day, Talha has made compulsory upon himself. The wording of the hadith is أوجب Talha, that Talha had made compulsory upon himself. What did he make compulsory is not mentioned in the hadith. this specific narration is in the Battle of Uhud, when we know the very famous incident that when the kuffar of Quraysh, they began to retreat and they began to go back, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had dispatched a small army on top of the mountain. It was a group of archers, and they were told not to move from their space until Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructs them to do so. But obviously, the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, when they saw that the Muslims had captured the battlefield, they began to come down, and it was a mistake on their part. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam acknowledged it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acknowledged it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgave them. At that time, when they began to come down, the army from behind the mountain attacked. And it was led by Khalid bin Walid, who later on became Muslim, and he was titled Sayfullah. That when the kuffar, they attacked, Muslim army that were chasing the kuffar were in the middle, and another group of army that came from behind them. So they were surrounded by kuffar. And this is the reason why it became really, really complicated in the battlefield as to which way to fight. Because they were chasing kuffar, which then later on they turned around, and then they were chased by kuffar from behind. So they were surrounded by kuffar, that whichever way they would turn, they would be kuffar. So there was no space for them to retreat and then gather and then attack. And in the midst of all of this, there was a claim made by the kuffar that, na'udhu billah, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam had passed away. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam had been martyred. And because of that, the emotional stress that the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in suffered, it caused them to lose their strength that they had to fight. They were suffering injuries, they were surrounded by enemies, and at the same time, they were emotionally disturbed because Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, according to their thinking, was martyred. So now in the midst of all of this, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to gather the Muslims around him and attack with force, so that way we can gather and attack at once. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to climb an elevated area, so he can make an announcement, and all the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in could see him at an elevated place, so that way the emotional stress that they were suffering, at least that would be gone, and they would gain strength by listening to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and seeing Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam alive. We know that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in this battle suffered a lot of injuries. He lost a tooth, and he had injuries to his face, and there was other Sahaba that suffered a lot of different injuries. Over 70 Sahaba were martyred on that day. It was a very harsh day. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he climbed on top of this boulder with the help of Talha radiyallahu an, and he made an announcement to all the Muslimun, and that's when they gathered and they attacked, and this is when the kuffar they left the battlefield, and the Muslims were left. This is not officially classified as a defeat in the history of Islam, because never ever it happened where the Muslims had to leave the battlefield. They never went back. It was just that some of the historians have called it as it was, as they mention in the Arabic language, that al-harbu sijal. Sijal just means like a bowl that is, like a bucket that is used to take out water from the well, that sometimes it is turned this way and sometimes it is turned the other way. So sijal is something that, sometimes it's a winning situation and sometimes it's a losing situation. And at a specific time, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he gathered all the Sahaba and the kuffar had left, once they reached an area when they knew that they were a little bit away from the Muslim army, they gathered and they said, why did we leave? They started doing mashara and they said, why did we leave? So now the kuffar, they started thinking that, yes, we should have never left. Let's go back and finish off the Muslims. This was their plan, to finish off the Muslims because they're injured. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at this time, he himself is injured, the Sahaba are injured, there are a lot of companions who are martyred, very, very elder Sahaba who were martyred. At that time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made an announcement, we must chase the kuffar. We must go after the kuffar. That's the only way they will not come back to us. And while everyone is injured, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gathered everyone, all the Sahaba, they gathered the little bit of strength that they have, and they begin to pursue the kuffar. When the kuffar heard that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not backing off, rather he is coming with his army in pursuit of us, then that's when they left and they never came back. And then the year after, there was a battle that was decided that we will meet again, and the kuffar didn't show up. It's a very lengthy detail. And then obviously they attempted other battles as well. These were the battles that were fought defensively. And the battle of Khandaq, the trenches, is when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was camped in Madinatul Munawwara. The kuffar had camped outside of Madinatul Munawwara. The Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, they had dug different trenches all around Medina, so the kuffar could not come in with their army. And they camped outside of the trenches, outside of Madinatul Munawwara for an extended amount of time. And one day Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent a wind, a very harsh wind that were blowing their tents away and their belongings away. And that's when the kuffar decided to go back. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a very powerful claim at that time. He said, these kuffar are going away now. They will never ever come back. They will never ever come back. And that was the last time the kuffar ever attempted any attack on the Muslims. And after that, every single battle that was fought was not attempted by the kuffar. It was done for other reasons, but it was not in attempt to retaliate against the attacks of the kuffar. So this is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophecy. So this was that exact time. And I want to point out, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the end mentioned Awjaba Talha. Talha bin Ubaidillah radiyallahu anhu. He was one of those Sahabi who were one of the 8 or one of the 10 first Muslims on the face of this earth. One of the first 8, and some say one of the first 10. He was also Ashara Mubashara. And Ashara Mubashara, a lot of times it might seem like a very small thing. Okay, there were Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam granted Jannah. But this was something special. Ashara Mubashara wasn't just a title to Jannah. But in one hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam named 10 Sahaba. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is naming these Sahaba in the midst of so many other Sahaba. If we were to look at any person that we consider superior to us, that we look up to, we consider them senior, and if they were to point us that I choose you in the midst of other people, it is a great privilege. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam not only chose this Sahaba to give them a task, give them a sign of leadership, or give them a worldly pedestal, but rather He guaranteed them something that no one after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam can ever guarantee for themselves or for anybody else. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam named 10 people, and these were the 10 individuals who are called Ashara Mubashara, and Talha bin Ubaidillah radiyallahu an, and also Zubayr ibn Awam radiyallahu an, who's narrating the hadith, is also one of them. So Talha bin Ubaidillah radiyallahu an is Ashara Mubashara. And he was amongst the 6 individuals. Now, in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we can say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam chose 10. It could be out of 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, 120,000. But after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Bakr radiyallahu an took the reins of Khilafah. And after Abu Bakr radiyallahu an, Umar radiyallahu an took the reins of Khilafah for almost 12 to 14 years. At that time, Islam had spread so wide that some historians write that Umar radiyallahu an used to rule 1/3 of the world. That's how big the Islamic kingdom was, the Islamic leadership was. That Khilafah of Mamlakat al-Islamiyah was that big. That Umar radiyallahu an was ruling almost 1/3 of the world. At that time, Umar radiallahu anh, when he's passing away, he chose 6 individuals. He chose 6 individuals and he said, I will choose you 6 to be the next Khalifa. One of you has to take the responsibility of running the Khilafah. And out of those 6 individuals, now imagine how many Muslims existed at that time. At that time, Umar radiallahu an chose Talha bin Ubaidullah radiallahu an to be one of them. So this was his status. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam once, this hadith is in Tirmidhi, he mentions, من سره إلى أن ينظر إلى شهيد يمشي على وجه الأرض فلينظر إلى طلحة. Subhanallah, very beautifully Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, he said, whoever wishes, whoever desires to look at an individual who walks the surface of this earth, this is exactly the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, من يمشي على وجه الأرض, who walks the surface of this earth, فلينظر إلى طلحة. He should look at Talha radiallahu an. And what's really amazing is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said this in the time of in Madinatul Munawwara, and Talha bin Ubaidullah radiallahu an passed away 25 years after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam says, "Man sarrahu an yandura ila shahidin." Man yandura ila shahidin. Whoever wishes to see a shaheed, a person who would be martyred. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is saying this in his lifetime, and Talha bin Ubaidullah radiallahu an passes away 25 years after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This was the prophecy of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He mentioned something, and we only know is going to be true. We went over this hadith before, that once Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam climbed the mountain of Uhud, and the mountain shook a little bit. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam took his staff, and he stamped the ground, and he said that stay firm, there is a Nabi, a Siddiq, and wa shahidan. There is a Nabi, a Siddiq, and shahidan on this mountain. There were 4 individuals on that mountain. One was Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who was the Nabi. Second was Siddiq, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu an, wa shahidan. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is saying this in his lifetime, and Umar radiyallahu an is passing away after 12 to 14 years in his khilafah. Wa shahidan. Uthman radiyallahu an is passing away even after that. Almost 25 years after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So this is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He always spoke the truth. He mentioned that this person is going to be shaheed even after, over 2.5 decades after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He is still truthful. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said a very powerful statement, أوجب طلحة. Talha had made compulsory upon himself. So the commentators, they mention, what was it that Talha had made compulsory upon himself? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is either referring to abundance of reward that Talha radiallahu anhu had made compulsory upon himself, or my intercession. Because Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam will intercede on behalf of the Muslims, and at that time, it comes in the hadith that even at that time, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would say, "This is my ummati," but the angels would grab him and say, "You're not aware of what this person did after you." And at that time, the intercession of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would not be for that believer. So this is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is mentioning that my shafa'ah has become obligatory and wajib upon Talha radiallahu an. And last is what the translation that Hazrat Shaykh Zakaria rahimahullah ta'ala also mentioned is Talha had made paradise compulsory upon himself. And obviously we know that he's amongst the Ashar Mubashara, and this is when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is saying Awjaba Talha is nothing less than paradise. That Talha radiallahu an has made paradise compulsory upon himself. The next narration is also very similar. وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن أبي عمر قال حدثنا سفيان بن عيينة عن يزيد بن خصيفة عن السائب بن يزيد رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان عليه يوم أحد درعان قد ظاهر بينهما. That on the day of Sahib ibn Yazid radiallahu anhu narrates, in the day of battle of Uhud, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam wore two pieces of armor, one over the other. Moving on to the next chapter, which is in regards to the helmet of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. وبه قال حدثنا قتيبة بن سعيد قال حدثنا مالك بن أنس عن ابن شهاب عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم دخل مكة وعليه مغفر فقيل له هذا ابن خطل متعلق بإستار الكعبة فقال اقتلوه. Anas radiallahu anhu narrates, the day Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam entered Makkah al-Mukarramah, he wore a helmet on his blessed head. He was informed that Ibn Khattal is clinging to the drapes of the Kaaba. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam replied, kill him. The next narration is also very similar. وبه قال حدثنا عيسى بن أحمد قال حدثنا عبد الله بن وهب قال حدثني مالك بن أنس عن ابن شهاب عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم دخل مكة عام الفتح وعلى رأسه المغفر. قال فلما نزعه جاءه رجل فقال له ابن خطل متعلق بإستار الكعبة فقال اقتلوه. قال ابن شهاب وبلغني أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يكن يومئذ محرما. This narration is also from Anas radiallahu anhu, in which he narrates that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam entered Makkah al-Mukarramah on the day of its conquest. So this is talking about Fath Makkah. He wore a helmet on his blessed head. After he had entered Makkah, he had removed that helmet, and once the helmet was removed, a person came and informed Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Ibn Khattal is holding on and clinging to the drapes of Kaaba, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam replied, uqtuluhu, kill him. And Ibn Shihab then mentioned, he's one of the narrators of this hadith, وَبَلَغَنِي أَنَّ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ لَمْ يَكُنْ يَوْمَئِذٍ مُحْرِمًا. That on that day, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was not in the state of ihram. A few things to remember. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam entered Makkah al-Mukarramah on this journey without an ihram. And we know that ihram is required to enter Makkah al-Mukarramah specifically for the purpose of Umrah or Hajj. According to all the Imam, ihram is wajib with that intention. Just without that intention, there's difference of opinion. We're not going to go into the fiqhi details of that. But Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the haram on that day would become halal for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And this is the same reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam wore a helmet, and wearing a helmet covering the head in the state of ihram would not be permissible. But on that day, it was permissible for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam as well as the Sahaba. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in the previous year, he had signed a peace treaty in which the kuffar of Quraysh were not following through. And once they broke the peace treaty, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam wanted to go and conquer Makkah al-Mukarramah, and free it from the hands of the kuffar and take it under the reins of Islamic Khilafah. And then obviously he will open the doors for ibadah and Hajj and Umrah and so on and so forth. And since that time till now, it's always been open to Muslims for ibadah. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he was entering, he clarified. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, لا أقسم بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد. That you were in a state where it was made halal for you, this city. According to Islam, and according to rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, lifting any type of weapon in the haram is not permissible. But Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam clarified it that lam yahillu lahu ba'di, that I have been given permission to do this, and it will not be allowed for anyone after me. regardless of what anyone claims, it will never ever be allowed till the Day of Judgment. And this is the same reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam took the army with the weapons, with everything, just to conquer it. And it was that one day it was allowed for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It will never ever be allowed for anyone after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered Makkah, he entered from the bottom, from the south end of it. And he told Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an to enter from the north side. And there was a small skirmish that took place in the north side of Makkah al-Mukarramah that some people tried to attack, and Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu an took care of them. Other than that, there was no fight in Makkah al-Mukarramah. So even though Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was ordered that if there is a need, it is halal for you. But there was no war taking place at that time, and there was no battle. There was only a number of people that were killed. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered Makkah al-Mukarramah, he made very open announcements. And he mentioned, any person who enters his house, he is safe. Any person who closes his door, he is safe. Any person who enters the haram, he is safe. Any person who enters the house of Abu Sufyan, he is safe. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kept mentioning different ways that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not want to fight. Did not want any bloodshed in Masjid al-Haram or in the Haram in general. The story with Ibn Khattal is Ibn Khattal had actually became a Muslim, and he was named Abdullah by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He serviced Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Madinatul Munawwara. After he became Muslim, once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent him on a task to collect zakah. At that time, when he was sent to collect zakah, there was some debate that took place. Obviously, it's in the books of history, so there's different things that are mentioned in regards to this specific incident as to what exactly happened. But him and his slave got into some type of argument over some food, and Ibn Khattal actually murdered his slave. Now, after murdering, as we know, that even in the previous nations and even in Islam in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the rule was anna nafsa bin nafs, that if you kill someone, walakum fil qisasi haya, that it would be death penalty in return. And this is why he became so fearful to return to Madinatul Munawwara. He took the money of zakah and he left to Makkah al-Mukarramah. And he denounced Islam, and he declared apostasy. And this is the reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had bloods on his hand, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to clarify that if a person is in deserving of hududullah, then clinging to the drapes of Kaaba will not save him. In the times of Jahiliyyah, there was this, it was a belief that if any person, regardless of his crime, if he goes and clings to the drapes of Kaaba, he would be forgiven. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also wanted to clarify that, and also establish the had of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that this person is deserving of having the death penalty. This is the reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had him killed. That he had declared apostasy, at the same time he had blood on his hand, and he had deceived a lot of people, and even at that time, the historians write that if he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he truly repented, even at that time Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have forgiven. But he followed the trends of Jahiliyyah, and he went and he was clinging to the drapes of Kaaba, but he did not come to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and declare tawbah nasuha. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam might have forgiven him, but he rather stayed there until he was killed at the place of Kaaba. And this is one of the few people. Some say there was only 4 people or 5 people that were killed on that day, and he was one of them. And this was the main reason why he was killed. When I was studying in regards to the armor and the swords, a very interesting story came. So inshallah, I thought I would just share it with you. Once Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman radiyallahu anhu and Rabi' ibn Amir radiyallahu anhu, they visited Kisra, who was the Persian emperor. The rule that the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in followed was they always tried to negotiate, and this was the principle that was taught to the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that whenever you approach any place that you are going to attack, always da'uhum ila al-Islam. The first thing is to invite them to Islam. And if they don't, then da'uhum ila al-Jizya. Then to try to establish taxes. And then if they don't and they refuse to accept Islam or to come under the reigns of Khilafah, then you are at that time only allowed to attack. So Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman radiyallahu anhu and Rabi ibn Amir radiyallahu anhu, the two Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, they go to the Persian emperor. And they go to the castle and they ask to be entered. So they inquired, they said, why are you here? This is the reason why we are here. So they said, okay, wait here. They send a person inside to go ask Kisra at that time that are they allowed to come inside or not. So at that time, Rabi bin Amir radiyallahu anhu, he was holding a sword. He had a sword. So the guard, he looks at the sword and he says, the sword had so many patches of metal that even the sword was not in one piece. So there were a lot of repair patches on the sword that whenever the sword would break or it would weaken from some place, he would take another piece of metal and weld it on top. So he said, you came to conquer Persia with this sword? So Rabi bin Amr radiallahu anh, he said, it's not the sword. It's the swordsman that counts. Just the way we would say, it's not the car, it's the driver. So similarly, it's not the sword, it's the swordsman, the person who is using the sword. So he said, bring me your strongest shield. And then, when that person brought it, he said, I want someone to hold it. And Rabi bin Amir radiallahu anh, with one strike, with that same sword that had, pieces of metal welded on all sides of it, he struck that shield and he broke it into two pieces. Right at that time. So now, this guard, obviously he was, he knew these weren't any ordinary individuals. Then the guard came back and he said, Kisra said, he will meet you. But he's not going to meet you in this attire. You need to change before you can be proceeded to Kisra. Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman radiallahu anh and Rabi ibn Amir radiallahu anh, without even doing mashawara, they said, that's not going to happen. We're not going to leave the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam for anyone. If Kisra would wish to meet with us, he would meet with us just like this. Otherwise, he will not meet with us. Now, obviously the guard went back. Kisra said, okay, obviously extraordinary people. We don't understand anything. Let him in. They go in. Before that, some historians narrate that food was served. And this is the same incident when the morsel of food fell onto the floor. And the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in radiyallahu anhum who were there, they picked up the morsel off the floor, just the way they were instructed by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and cleaned it, and they ate it. And they mentioned, you're in the royal kingdom, and you're eating on the royal dinner table, and you're picking up morsels of food from the ground. This is considered disrespectful. And the wording is the same wording that Uthman radiyallahu anhu said at the time of Sulh Hudaybiyah. That atruku sunnat Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam bihaulai al-ahmaqa. That am I going to leave the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam over these idiots? That is not going to happen. And then now, after dinner was over, now Kisra said, he wishes to meet them. So they go, they enter the royal palace where he was seated at a higher place and they were standing. So when Kisra wanted to converse with them, they said, before we say anything, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam prohibited us that one of us is talking while standing while the other one is sitting. Either you bring us chairs or you come down here and stand with us and we'll talk. This is the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That if one person is seated, the other one is standing, is disrespect to the person that is standing. So regardless of your status, you would either stand up or seat that individual. This is etiquette that is taught by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he said, either you come down here, or you bring us the same chairs that you're sitting on. That's the only way we're going to have this conversation. Now, Kisra, obviously, these individuals were very, very arrogant. They're used to, just hand motions and, 80,000, 100,000 individuals would move with their hand motions. So he said, you know what? You have humiliated me enough. He told one of the guards, fill a basket with dirt and put it on their head and kick them out of the castle and return them back. So now, obviously following the orders, this guard, he filled the basket up with dirt and he put it on their head and he told them to leave. While they're leaving, they said, Kisra, remember one thing. He said, Kisra, remember one thing. You have given us the dirt of Persia. You have given us the dirt of Persia. And they're leaving. Now, they left. Now, Kisra, he thought about, they're very superstitious people. They would believe in anything. So now they took a bad omen and they said, he started thinking, he was talented. He started thinking and he said, no, this can't be right. This statement that he made, he said, no, he sent the guards, he said, bring it back. Now the Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhi ajma'in are going and now there's a group of people running after them just to bring that same dirt back. Now the Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhi ajma'in are going ahead and there's a group of people that are chasing them just to fulfill the order of the king to bring that dirt back. So this is Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhi ajma'in. We talked about tawakkul in the beginning of the session also, that it is all our superstitions, that if we were to leave a sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we might have a bad impression on others. Who is controlling the mind and the heart of these individuals? The Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in are dealing with people who are known to be the most arrogant in history of the world. And yet, they did not choose to even leave a morsel on the floor. They did not choose to wear a separate attire. This is not the fara'id. This was not the sunan mu'akkida or the wujubat that they left. They held on to the simplest sunnah because they knew that whatever we do is not going. وَلَن تَرْضَى عَنْكَ الْيَهُودُ وَلَا النَّصَارَى حَتَّى تَتَّبِعَ مِلَّتَهُمْ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the Yahud and the Nasara will not be satisfied with you until you follow the same exact millah, which is 100% lifestyle that they follow. So a lot of times we feel, trimming a little bit of the beard or, wearing a different attire or behaving in a separate fashion or approaching someone differently might change how a person thinks about you. We need to understand that the qalb is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The mind is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is completely up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we don't want to go into details, but there is examples after examples after examples where a person just saw a person, even though it might seem like he might do the complete opposite, looking at his attire, looking at the way he's dressed, and looking at the way he carries himself, but the complete opposite was done. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's in his heart. And this is exactly what we need to bring into our personality, that it is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to act upon everything that was said. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to hold on to the smallest sunnah and practice upon them in our day-to-day lives. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. مولاي صل وسلم